Hello, good afternoon, welcome. It is February the 3rd, 2022. It's THCB gang. I'm your host, Matthew Holt from the healthcare blog at Baltimore on the Twitters, and great lineup today. And we're going to talk about the dirty little topic of money and digital health and some other stuff, but we're certainly going to focus on that with a gang who know all too much about it. Starting off, who have I got today? John and Neptune, from CEO of Suntra Modern Recovery from Manhattan. Ian Morrison and Jeff Goldsmith, my double trouble old men futurists. We were kidding about ages earlier. Bill Taranto, semi-frequent guest from Merck's venture fund. Jessica DaMassa, my co-host of Health Tech Deals and the host of WTF Health Interviews. And Michael Millinson from Health Quality Advisors. All right. Hi, everyone. Great to see all of you. We're going to start. I don't know if we'll get off this topic, but before we go around the room, we're going to start. We can get to other topics later. I think we should start with the thing that brought us all together today, which is a combination of Bill promising to tell us exactly how much all the Merck portfolio has been marked down over the last few months. And Jeff to tell us about his article, which if you haven't read it, you should do. It's on the healthcare blog today. But Jeff, why don't you start off and just give the quick byline about your article about the slough of despond of digital health stocks.
Well, I mean, what I talked about in the piece was that innovative digital health companies, in fact, innovative healthcare delivery companies, have just gotten slaughtered in this downturn in the market. Slaughtered. They're down anywhere from 70 to 90% from their 2021 peaks, and how I'm not sure it's over, incidentally. And what happens next? I mean, how do these innovative companies that have sucked down close to $50 billion in funding, how do they get traction in an environment where there is an increasing amount of skepticism about the whole space? I don't happen to share that skepticism. I am a digital health advocate and promoter. I'm also an investor. I've written six-figure checks to invest in digital health companies, and I've been following the space for 23 years. But I think this is a very trying time, not only for investors, but for founders. And the issue of where these companies go next is, I think, a very rich and meaty topic.
Oh, now I know you're running six-figure checks, Jeff. The healthcare blog could use some investment, or I could use a new car. One of the two.
Sorry, Matthew. I thought someone bought y'all already.
That was something else. That money has long been spent. Right. All right, fantastic. All right, well, let's quickly go around the horn, and there are probably some other topics as well we may want to raise, but that's clearly one for today. So why don't I start with you, Michael, and then we'll go around with Jess, Ian, JL, and Bill.
So speaking of hype, I've been looking at value-based care this week after listening to a symposium from all the policy wonks in DC talking about how it's inevitable. And of course, digital health in part is linked to the fact that the payment system will change. Well, buried in the medical literature has been a look at actually how are doctors actually paid, as opposed to all the hype about it's all going to be value, it's all going to be all the rest of this. Okay, of primary care docs, 84% get some sort of fee for service, of which it's like really substantial for maybe 70% of them. And for specialists, 93%, of which it's substantial for about 74% of them. Okay, so much for we're going to pay you for value, and therefore you have to adopt these things. Meanwhile, overuse of the system. Well, if you have investor-owned hospitals, they're overuse. And by the way, practice variation among doctors, because if we just left them alone, they would take care of all this, right? Just if we let professional kind of people do it. Well, since there's other people with gray hair beards among us, you may recall that the first articles on practice variation were 1973. The first congressional hearings on practice variation were 1954. Skip forward a mere half century, and looking at physician practice variation, it is still all over the place. And if you pick something like, something really difficult like prenatal screening, it goes from approximately 31% to 94%. among primary care doctors, that kind of area, and it continues. And by the way, when you take away the incentive for payment for like an ACO, the preventive services go away. So what this tells us is that if you're an entrepreneur who just knows doctors and health systems are going to buy your product because they're being paid differently, maybe eventually they will, but maybe not tomorrow.
In the long run, we may all be dead. Ian.
Well, I think we should definitely talk about Jeff's piece. I thought it was great. And I always learn from Bill and Jess on these calls. I've been deep with the incumbents actually the last 2 weeks. Did an in-person retreat. Jeff knows this. It was supposed to be at Pebble Beach, and they moved it to Fresno.
I'm sure them excellent golf courses.
They're lovely people.
Super 8, right?
Yeah.
No. Times are tough, Ian.
Yeah, exactly. But actually, they're lovely people. No, and it was done for the right reasons, to be safe. But I'm master of ceremonies, dancing bear at Vizient's conference next week with 150 CEOs, and I've been on a bunch of prep calls with all of them. And I got to tell you that the old health system is slammed right now. I mean, even though cases are coming down, I mean, Cedars has 201 COVID patients. Stanford has 128. Community Hospital Modesto has 285. And deaths are going to peak probably in the next 10 days. So frontline staff are just, beaten. Right. So while we're all celebrating the digerati, the real health systems, just about spent.
Right. Absolutely. JL.
So I've spent the last couple of days dancing on the grave of IBM Watson. Matthew, you may remember, we talked many times when we were working together. I always questioned the hype around IBM Watson. I actually knew a bunch of people who worked there, but as a physician, I always questioned, the power of AI and was the technology really ready for prime time? And as a physician, I never thought that the technology was there. As we saw this week, IBM Watson is finally being sold off into parts. Francisco Partners, a private equity firm, bought their market scan database of 275 million patient records for $1 billion. So the data is valuable for sure, but IBM Watson was never really able to make the technology work. And I always point out that one of my career highlights is pointing out once in a tweet that MD Anderson had spent over $80 million on IBM Watson technology for no benefit. And I got a like from Vinod Khosla, and it's on my resume, and I'm still telling my mom about that.
Wow. Well, I'm glad your career has mattered so much. Jessica.
All right, I love Jeff's article. It's very thought-provoking for me. I have a hard time.
Hang on. Is it true that you did a PowerPoint rebuttal to an earlier edition?
It wasn't a rebuttal at all.
It wasn't. It was points of information. I was just referring. I hope it was helpful, Jeff. Was it helpful?
Really helpful. I stole some of those slides for a presentation this afternoon.
I've been stealing Jessica's ideas for at least 5 years by now.
Yeah, that's where Matthew Holt gets all his stuff nowadays.
Well, you got to get it from somewhere.
But listen,
right?
all we do is retweet you, Jess. That's it.
Oh, you guys. No, so really though, read Jeff's piece if you haven't already read it. I had a couple questions, and this is what I sent to him in the notes, because I was honored truly to be asked early on what I thought. And I have a couple different comments on it. I think one of the things is, how are we defining digital health? And when we talk about in bulk, what are these things that are failing on the stock market? And then also there's a big difference between what went public and what's private. And if it did go public, I think there's a big difference between what went public via traditional IPO and what went public via SPAC. Because last year we saw more SPACs. I mean, I think the total number of public exits was 23. 15 of those were SPAC IPOs, and the other 8 were regular run-of-the-mill IPOs. The year before, there were 2 SPAC IPOs. So I think there's something in that might be messing up this feeling of like, oh my God, we were so exuberant and now we're crashing down, that I think is not 100% accurate to what's going on. I think the other thing too is, when we look at all of this stuff, I mean, not all the technology is created equal, right? Not all of it is doing the same kinds of things. So I take health tech, the category, and I put it into two compartments. There's technology for healthcare services. So this is all that stuff that an incumbent could plug in to make their services better, whether you're a plan or a provider. So it's like the chatbot stuff, the digital front door stuff, the analytics stuff, the remote patient monitoring, the telehealth that you plug in. There's all that on one side. And on the other side, there's these new healthcare services businesses that are being stood up on that technology from the get-go. So think like new health plans, like Medicaid plans like Circulo Health or like Bright Health, or think like new PBMs like Capital PBM, or even some of these navigator businesses like Len Tolman's Transcarent. They're standing up whole different types of healthcare services businesses on that technology from the beginning. Virtual first primary care clinics, in-person, virtual, whatever, that whole mess. All of those guys are doing stuff that's different. So I don't think you can look at the whole mess of it equally. That said, I argued with Jeff about where we were in the hype cycle, because I don't think that we're in the trough. I feel like we hit the trough of all this stuff. And Matthew, I'd be curious to hear what you have to say. Bill too, actually all you guys, about like what happened after Gaslight went public in 2014. And then the market kind of dipped in that, what is it, 17, 18, where there were no public exits at all. The funding kind of stood still. It actually dipped down in 2020, the VC funding did. I mean, I feel like that was the trough. And then what happened after that, whether it's inflated by COVID or not, I feel like we're aiming toward that plateau of productivity where these big guys are in too deep as far as the investment goes, where they're going to back away completely now. Like it's ingrained. Like there's stuff that they've paid for over the last decade that now is the time to make good on it.
We shall see. Bill, you can tell us how your portfolio is doing. You, of course, were Hate says one of the very big winners early on in the current cycle, with at least one or two of those companies that you've marched out of the fund. So, but I did notice one thing. I did notice that Tiger, which is one of the ones which dived into a lot of sectors, but obviously digital health in the last 6 months, apparently it's marked down a whole bunch of its numbers from last year, and particularly more. So, and as Jess, it's fair to say that SPACs, maybe some of the less worthy companies may have SPAC'd out rather than the IPO, but the ones that IPO'd, have also done pretty badly, certainly since their highs, even though their highs were massively overblown. Bill, what's your take on this?
Well, it's first let me say I enjoyed Jeff's article. I actually agree with a lot of what he said. The world's made up of rational and irrational investors, and it's the nature of the game. But I'm an optimist as well, like Jeff, and I'm an investor. And the interesting thing that I've been looking at in the last month or so is on our team, we call it the dented can approach. And what's going to happen is you're going to see a lot of these companies turn into these dented cans, in which you're going to see the opportunity for recap. And I think in your article, you mentioned Optum had tons of cash. Well, if you're patient, have a lot of cash like we do, yep, and you're smart investors and rational, it's actually an opportunity to come in, and someone spent hundreds and hundreds of millions to build a pretty good quality company, but the P&L didn't support the valuation. Right. It's a great opportunity to come in and recap and take over these companies, and I think that's what the PE firms are going to do too. That are the more rational ones, and so I think there's actually a very optimistic market on some of these companies. This is not just the IPO SPAC; it's also some of the private companies that have overinflated valuations. And whether we're in it, I think we're kind of in this middling area. It's not a trough, but we're in a serious situation where not only do these companies overvalued, the P&Ls don't support those valuations, but I think a lot of things that happen too. There's a lot of new money coming into healthcare, and people don't understand the complexity of healthcare, and that these companies don't scale overnight like typical tech companies like Facebook overnight in everybody's household. Healthcare is still local and regional, and it takes a long time to scale and build these companies. And I think a lot of this new money thinks it's too similar to a tech firm where they can be built overnight, but they just can't. And you have to have that kind of patience. And I think more slowly build these companies. So I still think there's a future market for IPOs and SPACs, but it depends on what the company looks like from a P&L perspective and how it's been built and who the investors are. I think is the thing. So that's what I've been looking at. I think there's actually an opportunity. And one quick thing for Jean-Luc, just because you mentioned IBM Watson, and I do this as a side, but it's a true story. So when I joined Merck and started the fund, we got invited to IBM up at the New York office to visit and learn about IBM Watson. And if you recall, they used to do the Jeopardy game with
Sure.
So a gentleman named Merv Turner, who was the chief strategy officer at Merck, actually beat IBM Watson in the Jeopardy game. And things that happened, but there's enough witnesses that were there that saw it happen. And it came down to one final question. It was such an obscure scientific area of which he actually studied and knew the answer in like a split second and actually beat IBM Watson. And so it just shows you that, it's quite infallible even at the beginning. So.
Slumdog Millionaire story right there.
So I got that's funny. So I mean, I think it goes with saying though that and Jess and me do this on a more than once a week basis, looking at there is still no real slowdown in the big funding rounds from all your brethren in the VC world, Bill, and actually in the in the private equity world. And even we saw this week, a $500 million investment into a no-name physician group in Florida, primary care group in Florida that, that's like the ones that have been beaten, and as well as multiple $100 million plus rounds still over the last few months. While, we've been talking about this public market crash since, when it was 30-40% down from the peak in the summer, and then, when it was 60-70% down. Now the last few weeks it's been 80% plus down, from the height, and the height was super high. I mean, let's be clear, there was really crazy stuff going on sort of a year and change ago. But nonetheless, it seems to me that I can't believe, just because the quantities going in, that the valuations in the private market have changed yet. Now maybe they're not going to be able to come out or something, but are the valuations you're seeing down to a significant extent from where they were last year? That's a question for you, Bill. When you're being asked for money.
Well, again, it's based on the rational and irrational investors that come into the market, right? But what you're seeing is, at least what I'm seeing is, the more disciplined investors, we're waiting now. There's no reason to pay some of these inflated prices.
Right.
But there's money. That's the other problem. There's so much money going into healthcare. I think on one of your shows last year, it was mentioned that there was this astronomical amount of money sitting in SPACs unused in healthcare.
Yeah.
Right.
Dollars, and that money has to be used. Mm-hmm. And what ends up happening is, are they then, to get rid of that money, putting it into companies that actually shouldn't be IPOing or SPACing at that time? And the answer is yes, right? But that money has to be deployed. And so I just think you're going to see it for a little bit, but I think I believe there's a market correction coming that's going to be pretty heavy. I believe in this dented can situation where it does present opportunities for the right investor, but these companies cannot support the economics that are in the market today.
Hey, Matthew, I mean, the numbers I've been seeing, and I read fairly widely, that between private equity and the large scale venture funders, there's $1.5 to $2 trillion of dry powder. Okay, you don't spend it and you have to give it back to your limiteds. So that's an ugly situation right there. And then I hear stories, and I'm not as well plugged in as Jess is. It's probably just as well. It would blow my fuses if I was, of people that are out raising $20 million, and the guys come to him and say, well, what about 120 million? Where people are joking about the foie gras phenomenon of money just being forced down the throats of people that didn't really need it. So what does that tell you? This is a crazy valuation environment. And what Bill said, I think is absolutely dead right. The problem that a lot of folks that are going to have that want to be market consolidators, integrators, recappers or whatever it is do they want to catch a falling knife?
It's interesting you
mentioned that,
Jeff.
all over their portfolio. So, and then in addition to that, in addition to all the private equity and VC dry powder, I read this morning in The Economist that people's household balance sheets grew by $2.5 trillion during the recession, or this, COVID recession. $2.5 trillion because we grossly overstimulated our economy. A huge chunk of that went into Robinhood and get chatted about on Reddit. And a whole lot of crazy people are out there writing checks that they're never going to see the money again. This is a really terrible environment to be a purchaser of one of these companies. It's a great time to be a seller.
We're going to NFT the healthcare blog, the THCB gang.
Oh, great. Send me my.
You're the first among us bored apes here, Jess. Jess, you wanted to jump in, but just to let you know, I was at a conference yesterday, a VC conference in San Diego in digital health, and I spoke to 3 different startups, all of whom were going through another round, which was quote unquote forced upon them. They weren't out looking; people came after them still, and we're now a year since the height of the Teladoc at $300, and now it's at 60. And as Jeff mentioned in his piece, the same thing is true for the quote unquote value-based care crowd, Oak Street and More Medical. The same thing is true for the insurers, right? Who are we should have Emily Evans on here to celebrate that, going short of. She said Clover was going to 0. Well, it's 2. I know she gets credit for it anyway. Jess, sorry.
Correct. Yeah.
I was just going to say the same thing that you mentioned, Matthew, is that I have spoken with a couple of different startups who told me that they were raising rounds and that they've actually gone to investors that have said, we are not going in on this round, but if you wanted to double it, come on back. We'll fund that instead. I mean, that to me is like, unprecedented. At least 3 different startups have told me that in the last couple of weeks.
Yep.
Yeah, just that support. I mean, I love the dented can metaphor, and there is, Matthew, you were the first one to point this out, in the Castlight example, of the private money being used to take former publicly companies off the table. Was another one I think you tweeted about today. I forget.
Today at SOS Telemed, which is
But I mean, when we were, at least last time I was on with Bill, I mean, I remember we were talking about this great sorting out just at the end of last year, based on the disciplined investor. And I think Bill's absolutely right in terms of what we're seeing. But to Jeff's point in the article, you got to start with the premise that there are some valuable things we ought to be doing with this stuff. It's not like it's all rubbish. It's the question of getting it embedded inside the health system, and whether it's going to be a de novo kind of startup, Jonathan Bush vision or Glenn Tolman vision, or whether it's the embedding, which I tend to be more in favor of, is the embedding of these tools and technologies inside the existing system to make it better. And we might see a bit of both, but there are going to be winners out of this for sure in the final analysis, because everybody's going through digital transformation eventually. We're really, really, really late to the party. I mean, Jeff and I are old enough. We've been doing this shtick for 30 bloody years. I mean, I wrote the justification for an all computerized hospital at the University of British Columbia in 1979, for God's sake.
So Ian, when I was researching my book, the first computerized use of sort of predictive analytics to see whether, we look at the medical record, I found was 1959. And Wall Street Journal article. Then the other day, my mom was in the occupation government from Germany after World War II. I was doing some look at reports that British and American intelligence were trying to find things that they could use from Germany for intellectual reparations to bring back like the scientists and all that. And I came across something where they turned out that German veteran soldiers' hospitals were using primitive computers, the Hollerith cards, the predecessor to IBM, to look at medical records of the soldiers, outcomes, and compare different hospitals. And of course, God forbid that anybody should have taken that technology and then used it and advanced that kind of stuff. So, it's all the financial incentives. It's all, the great thing about the Amazons and the Googles and all the rest coming in is that they force the incumbents to encounter digital health reality. Because otherwise they'd be happy to say that switching from fountain pens to ballpoints was their great technological advance.
The ghost of Ernest Emery Codman, I can see, has emerged on the show again with his
but let's not, as old people, get sentimental. I mean, in a go-forward basis, that Jeff raised an interesting example, the graphite example in his piece. I talked to our friend Raj Agarwal the other day, and what they're doing with Panda, we should maybe sort of give them due credit about trying to curate. And if you talk to Elizabeth Mitchell at PBGH, they're trying to curate and referee some of these digital solutions. So I think part of what we're going to see is a sorting out, but there are going to be people in this game who are overseeing that sorting out, whether it's United in terms of their willingness to buy things, or whether it's some of the actors who are the proxies for the money, whether it be the health plans who are purchasing these, the big retailers who are looking for partners, or whether it's employers. So, I mean, I'd love to hear the view of the group of how that part of the ecosystem is going to sort out, because they're going to have influence on whether there's a few key players. Because the frightening thing in Jeff's article was there isn't a platform. It's just, a gong show for the next 10 years.
Let me add one thing before the group, which is that the other thing that, traditionally, and Bill, this is something you know so well, right? But the point of venture capital, right, is you fund you fund a platform, you fund a Facebook, a Google, or whatever you fund, and they lose money for a ton of years while they're building out their platform, their network, and then they're incredibly profitable. Somebody somewhere in this digital health world, with the exception of Doximity, which has got an advertising pharma marketing model, no one seems to have cracked the thing about how to become profitable as you expect. I mean, these guys are losing more money now than they were losing a couple of years ago, like the Amwells, and not so much to tell that, but some of them are. So bundle that into it as well. I mean, at some point, okay, there's unlimited money around, as Jeff said, but bundle that in. Jeff.
Here's how crazy it is that, you go and look at Teladoc's numbers, which I did about 2 weeks ago. They cash flowed on operations in 2019 before all this crazy stuff started. They generated cash from operations in 19. They generated $110 million in cash in operations in the third quarter of 21, and their stock crashed. So I'm having a lot of trouble with what's the reality, what is the benchmark of reality on the basis of what you're valuing these companies?
Well, I just got a tweet. Amazon stock's up 16% after market. It just doubled its profit. And you got Facebook tanking 25%, and Spotify down. By the way, my wife went to school with Neil Young and got thrown out for smoking cigarettes with him in Winnipeg in 1964. So
should have vaccinated her against that.
She's taking credit for policing Josh Rogan. But hell, you're the money guys here. Help me make sense of this. On the one hand, Google had knockout earnings, and Facebook narrowly misses, and it goes down 25%. I mean, that's part of this backdrop here of euphoria on trend watching, it seems to me.
But the problem with the healthcare companies, getting back to Jeff, is he mentioned Teladoc. So what happens with a lot of these companies, they're point solutions, right? They're not integrated solutions. They're usually one-off point solutions, which I've always said don't work in healthcare. You got to think of a more of an ecosystem approach, an integrated approach. Even Teladoc in its size, right? It was originally a primary care telehealth organization. They did buy Livongo, but Livongo was a point solution as well because it was a diabetes. In order for that company to grow, they're going to have to acquire and expand their offering to move away from that point solution. So what happens is you have there's way too many companies. I don't know how many more mental health companies we can have out there. It's an important area, but there's a lot of them, right? And they're either someone's going to come in and consolidate these to have a more integrated solution within that space, because ultimately that's what happens when you start to value these companies in the real world. You realize that they do one thing, they don't do enough of it, and then they can't get the revenue to support what they originally supposed in their valuation or their IPO or their SPAC to get launched. And these companies they just don't serve enough of the healthcare environment in order to survive. And that's one of the point solutions.
And Matthew, to jump in on that, I think, I in terms of thinking about venture, I'm heavily influenced by Peter Thiel and his notion that, your goal as an entrepreneur should be to be a monopolist, right? So if you think about Facebook, it was Facebook's interest. There was only going to be one dominant social network. I mean, LinkedIn is out there as well, but Facebook was going to be willing to spend as much money as they could so that they could capture and control that market and then achieve above average returns on their advertising businesses, or whatever the terminology would be. I think the problem in the digital health space, as Bill was saying, you've got 100 different mental health companies, all of them raising venture money with the hope that they would have some kind of market power in the future. But the problem is none of them has any significant market share. It is a hyper competitive environment where everybody is pricing to try to get market share, and they just cannot build profitable businesses in their current state. I continue to think you're going to see a lot of consolidation, and as these markets consolidate and you can get market power, then you can start to get above average returns. But until that, it's just a bloodbath. And certainly in my space, the addiction space, I mean, I've seen so many companies raising $20 million Series A, $100 million Series B for companies that have de minimis market share and really are pretty much giving the product away as they try to gain market share.
Which is also what's happening in the health plan space. I mean, I looked at, Oscar today. Oscar has 594,000 subscribers spread out over 219 markets. So if I'm Ascension Health or UCLA or Cedars or whatever it is, the network guy from Oscar comes in and, oh, I've got 6,000 people in your service area. He's not going to get the world's greatest rates. So I think a lot of people are, there was an article in Axios just a week or two ago, basically showing that for all the folks that have piled into Medicare Advantage, the 5 or 6 big indemnity and Blue Cross plans control like 85 or 90% of the market. They're going to get killed. They can give their product away until the cows come home, and they're going to go frickin' broke.
Well, I mean, if you look at it, that's kind of what's happening. I mean, Clove was the shining example, right, which has a medical loss ratio of above 100%, which is pretty clever. Anyone managed to run a health plan. But it's interesting that, Humana, among others, missed its numbers on growth. Admittedly, they added more than Devoted, Clover, and Oscar have got put together, but they missed their numbers because some of the regional plans like Scan and others, aggressively coming after them on benefits or on. So that is getting tougher and tighter in the Medicare Advantage side. I would say that ties back into. Sorry, Michael, I'll just come back to you in a second. But that ties into what Michael was saying about risk, right? Which is that you've got to at some point. Jess said there, as I stole her idea. Was it your idea or my idea? I can't remember, Jess. Probably yours. But there are companies that are building new companies on technology, and there are companies that are selling the technology to old companies. Doesn't sound like either side of the battle is doing that well of the newer companies, whereas the Epics and the Cerners and the people selling to health plans are still doing fine. But I mean, I guess that's my concern remains that we do have, we do have, growth and activity in these risk-bearing areas. Medicare, I know we argued about it the last time we were on in terms of Medicare Advantage and how much of a system it is versus the games that are played. But nonetheless, it seems to me that we're not seeing the breakthrough that you see in other industries. Michael,
I mean, how risky is this? I mean, really? I mean, like $40 billion in funding last year. Jeff, your article's like Optum's sitting on $70 billion in cash. They could have funded the whole thing twice, and they're still making $2 billion a month. Like, how big of a risk is this really? So it's like, yeah, there's a million digital mental health companies, but it's like in the scheme of things, like $100 million into that is really in healthcare, nothing. Nothing. I feel like that's low risk.
That's such a good point, Jess. I mean, I've moderated a growth equity retreat every year for many years in healthcare. I will remain nameless, and sometimes they invite the limited partners along. And like, I made friends with this guy who was running basically $1 billion out of funding out of San Francisco just to invest in American healthcare from the Queensland Pension Fund in Australia, right? There's just so much freaking money out there. And these guys, if you talk to them, they're just saying, look, healthcare as a share of global GNP is going to do nothing but go up, Now, you got to find guys like Bill who know what they're talking about, can actually tell you where to invest it. But But the point is that the actual front end of this is a rounding error, if you're a sovereign wealth fund.
I mean,
So
it's more risky to me than a traditional tech investment. Has Uber yet to turn a profit? I mean, I'm just saying, that to me is much more risky than the environment that healthcare creates, where it's like, if you figure out how to get a billing code, eventually, if you hang in there long enough, you're going to make some money.
Michael, we're trying to go to you.
So I add to what Ian and Jeff said in terms of the money, that even though humanity didn't make its numbers and its stock, well, it put an extra $1 billion into Medicare Advantage. Now, if you're trying to compete against an extra $1 billion in there, right? And fortunately, they have people who were paid a very nice amount of money to figure out that billing code and other advantages, and the way you combine plans to get star ratings and all the other tricks. But it absolutely isn't there. I do have to say that I feel really badly listening to this group that I didn't have my own startup that I was going to call the P.T. Barnum Healthcare Company, and I was going to go around to people who would give me more money than I needed. And until I had the highest valuation possible. So I'm feeling a little guilty about my honest upbringing as I listen to the opportunities that I appear to have missed.
There are a few of these. I did meet somebody at the conference that I was at yesterday who was called in to deal with Outcomes Health. Were the ones who took $500 million off Goldman Sachs. There'll be a trial, a Theranos-like trial next year. And I do remind you that the is it Ubiome? The Ubiome founders are still on the run from the FBI. haven't been caught yet.
But if I did it right, I'd have enough money to pay for the consent decree. So that's white collar crime does in fact pay.
Now, I wanted to mention on something that Jessica said, about all the money in the market, but I think the fundamental problem, I think you're right in some respects, Jessica, but what you kind of don't see all the time is you see like Optum has 70 billion. They can play the game, right? Maybe that sovereign wealth fund has $1 billion, but most funds don't raise that kind of money, right? And 100, 150, 200 million dollar fund that's investing in wherever companies are investing in, they don't have that risk profile of just hanging around long enough with that investment capital. They can't survive because these companies just aren't successful, and they take too long to be successful, I think in the long term. So it's a game of, as I think I said at the beginning, it's who has money, who has patience, and who has rationality is probably going to win.
Bill, I want to ask you real quick on that. Do you think that the entrance of private equity money over the last 2 years in particular has changed that a little bit? Because I feel like they can go a little bit longer. Their coffers are usually bigger, right?
Well, they're doing the consolidation, which I like. I think healthcare, I think this market is ripe for consolidation. I think JL said it as well. I think they have the capital to do that. So certainly Optum does, and any of the other big boys out there that want to enter healthcare. That's, Apple could enter healthcare and buy a pharma company if they wanted, without blinking an eye, right? It's just whether they want to be in that kind of business. So I think you're right. I think the private equity, the hedge fund, who has capital is going to better control the game. Because
are you feeling that, not being in one of those?
Well, we have our own private equity firm as well.
Yeah.
That's how we did Preventus and a number of other things. We have both our venture fund and our private equity fund. And we use the private equity fund, the GHI private equity, to consolidate assets to scale. Because, even in a Merck, if they even wanted to acquire something, $100 million revenue company has no impact on our P&L, but a 500 to $1 billion is like a little brand, right? So we even have to provide scale, but I think the companies work better as they scale, and so that's the game we play. That's why for me, this sort of dented can concept is great, because I'm just sitting back going, I've got capital, both in my fund and my private equity fund. And if something looks really good that provides value to the market, I think I've got a great opportunity to consolidate.
Let me ask you a question, Bill, and for the group, right? So if you go back 20 years, something not incredibly dissimilar happened, not so much in digital health, but in tech as a whole, right? We had the big .com run up, we had the crash, led by Dr. Coop and some others. I mean, Dr. Coop was the one highlighted in the March 2020 Barron's article about all these public companies that are about to run out of money, and somewhere around there, the NASDAQ went from 5,000 to 1,000. Right? I mean, it's worth remembering the NASDAQ, which has been with the NASDAQ, which has been going up like a rocket while the digital health has gone down. You know, the digital health and NASDAQ separated has started coming down, but it's been driven by those big monopoly tech companies, right? The big guys have become more and more of an impact on it. And the reason it's recovered lately has been Google and Amazon and what have you. But if you remember that, there was, you know, a 2, 3, 4 year period where you could buy a lot of these. You could buy Amazon very cheap, and you could buy a bunch of other companies very cheap. So 2002 through about 2004, 5, 6, and then Google went public and things started picking up a bit into the 2008 crash, which in all retrospect, didn't last that long in technology. So I guess the question is, how close are we to having the kind of the money dry up from the limiteds, as well as from the, you know, how long before the $1 billion fund from the guy in Queensland or wherever, you know, the interest rates go up and looking for equities and looking for startups is not where they're going to start putting that money, which will in turn drop the pricing. So people like Bill who was sitting there with a dry powder on the sidelines can pick up stuff cheap and start building consolidation. Is that happening soon, or are we going to have to hang out for 2 more years while, you know, VCs have just got to spend the money they've got? That's just suggesting.
I'm going to let Bill, who is actually a professional investor sitting on a ton of cash, answer this question definitively. But if you can't get out of your investment, you don't get in. So the SPAC was a way to get out. IPOs were a way to get out. Selling it to somebody else, another private equity firm, is a way to get out. If people stop buying these companies, then the investment dries up. So, I mean, Bill may have a different view of this than I do.
No, not at all, actually. And then I think you're 100% right. And it gets to the comment I just had with Jessica. If your fund if you're not making money for your LPs, you're not raising another fund. It dries up pretty quickly. But we are seeing, you know, even though there's a lot of capital available, doesn't necessarily mean it's all going to be deployed. I think there's a pullback coming on investing. I think GHI is certainly going to be doing a lot less investments this year, just because we're going to be a little more watchful of what's happening in the market. But the one thing that does always happen, though, I've seen and does in healthcare, if you remember back in that early 2000s, we didn't even call it digital health, it was just IT or HIT. There's always this kind of grouping of companies that seem to emerge. You know, and back then it was the EMRs, it was all the data infrastructure, the data security, privacy, and storage, or the aggregation, integration, and harmonization, and the beginning of analytics and informatics at that time. Those companies really flourished, you know, during that time. There's always seems to be a grouping of companies that seem to do well during these downturns because they have the right kind of, whether it's delivery, right product, you know, whatever it is that they have, there's something there that the market is still demanding, regardless of what happens with the funding. But I just think that there's going to be a pullback. Personally, I agree with Jeff, everything he said. It's just, I think it's within the next 24 months. It's not going to happen overnight, right? There's still a lot of money available, but these companies just aren't going to survive as time goes on.
Well, you know, I mentioned Optum in my article, and, you know, I know a little bit about these guys and I've watched them for a long time. They don't do non-accretive deals. They don't do speculative deals. They have a tremendous amount of discipline, and they're looking for stuff that complements what they're already doing, that provides them operating leverage for the businesses that they're already in. And if they see something, you know, they're not going to pay 25 times earnings. They're not going to pay 7 or 8 times revenues, even if it helps them. So I think, you know, what's sort of scary about Optum and United is the cash is piling up. I kind of wonder at what point that discipline actually hurts them, and a lot of their shareholders start saying, why don't you give it back to us by raising your dividends? If there isn't stuff to spend it on that's accretive to their businesses, then they're going to have to do something with the money. So at some point, that $2 billion a month that they're accumulating cash becomes something of a problem.
That's the kind of problem I'd like to have on a much smaller scale. But let me say 3 things that I heard a lot loud and clear yesterday, and Ian's already alluded to one of them. Right, one is pressure on the current health system, particularly around employment, staffing, finding people. There is still a war for talent at every level, whether it's for startups, clinicians across the board. We're getting this situation where current nurses are getting really pissed because travel nurses are showing up in their junior travel nurses are showing up in their break room and are making 4 times the amount of money they're making, and there's a lot of issues around there, sending with doctors and elsewhere. The second thing I heard loud and clear from a couple of these companies that have grown really fast in the last 2 years, and really fast, I'm talking, from 0 to 500 employees, is that because of the global labor, not the global, the labor shortage in general in the economy, employers, I'm going to have Jen Benz on this week, but employers are now offering, are happy to do virtually anything to keep somebody in the seat and not leave. And that includes, throwing on benefits that look irrationally expensive. I saw a weight loss program yesterday, which, would be a traditional employer, who was worried about the cost of healthcare, wouldn't be funding, but was happy to fund it because it'll keep the person on the program there for a year or two. So I'm wondering if there is, something that's going to stop that before we get back to normalcy of having more people looking for jobs than there are jobs, as opposed to the other way around, and less money sloshing around down the system than we've had put in the last few years. When do we think we get back to normal? So those the weird normal, the weird excess market conditions actually impact back on healthcare or an investment. Is that happening? Does anyone see that happening anytime soon? Michael?
But Jeff, I was looking at the end of the year at the surveys on employee benefits by all the big companies, right? By the Mercers and the Towers and all the rest of these guys. And what's interesting is they all agree, when you take a look at the super large companies, the health benefits they're offering are way, more sophisticated than before. And that actually can help support the digital health companies, right? Because they're the ones who are offering some of the, fertility stuff that's remote, and the monitoring and the ordering and all the rest of that. And so you actually have something where the companies that need the most sophisticated talent, which is an Accenture or someone like that, they can write off, they're going to offer those kind of benefits. And that can actually provide some support for the marketplace. And then after a while, when Ian talked about how under stress the traditional care system is, that's not a time when you adopt new technology. Particularly, we all know that version 1.0 of whatever the vendor is selling is not going to work the way it did in the 15-minute dog and pony show that he showed the investors, right? And so I think that actually employers in some ways, and as intermediaries, as we talked about, may be a support for the big employers for some of this happening. And when we get back to quote unquote normal, is just tell us when all the variants stop, Matthew.
Yeah,
It's a big problem. The employer thing is a big problem. I'm sitting on 35 or so portfolio companies, and these are really good companies. It's just they're competing against each other in some respects for the same talent, and they also have so many resources to give away.
Right.
But the demands that I would say the other side is demand by CEOs or prospective CEOs or C-suite employees is they are in a leveraged position right now to ask for a lot more equity, a lot more things than we're used to giving, but you don't have a choice at the moment.
Fantastic. So Bill, tell me where to apply. I could use some big time equity on. I'm available for that kind of
You're
stuff.
unemployable.
Unemployable. Jessica, then Jeff, then Ian.
I just don't think we return to a normal. And I think, for me, I think about, the number of women who left the workforce, and the fact that 1 in 3 of them who left during the pandemic has no intentions of going back. I think the workforce as we know it is forever changed. And what that means in terms of how that's going to play out in the world of healthcare and employer health benefits and all of that is going to have repercussions for a long, long time. I don't think normal as it was before is going to exist again. I mean, you can't lose that many of half of the population of this country and expect it to look the same as it did before.
Right. And also, Matthew, particularly to extend what Jess is saying, particularly as it relates to healthcare workforce, right? I mean, think about doctors and nurses who have died or who have retired. I have a friend who has a Park Avenue practice. They had half of their physicians who were over the age of 60 retire, right? So that's how many years of experience and expertise in a space that was already constrained for capacity. So I think that the workplace shortages of every single type of licensed professional in healthcare, that is going to continue to be a problem, and you're going to continue to see this phenomenon of hospitals competing for each other, wages going up. I think it's going to persist for a long time.
We're back to Vinod Khosla. 80% of them going to be replaced by computers. Sorry, Jeff.
Now's the time for IBM Watson.
Yeah,
Jeff.
Yeah, I think the answer, I agree with what Jess and Jean-Luc just said, that we ain't going back. And unfortunately, the problem with Michael's thesis is, if you're looking for excellence, in search of excellence, you ain't going to find it in HR. I think that's why it takes so much longer. Suzanne Delbanco is a friend. I've watched her struggle for years with the Catalyst for Payment Reform, trying to get any good idea in the benefits
Jeff,
the scale.
right.
It just ain't going to happen. So I think, when I'm talking to the same folks that, let me finish. When I'm talking to the same folks, the number one issue for them, the number one strategic issue is workforce. There really isn't a second one. And if some of these tools help with that workforce problem, fantastic. But the people that are searching for those solutions, the people that are going to have to actually implement those solutions, in a lot of cases, just flat out don't know how to do it.
I agree with you completely, with one small caveat. Absolutely, because I say all the time that HR people, their second choice of a job was not fighter pilot. There are some super large companies that have really good people. There are a few, but you're right in terms of scaling. And I think you're absolutely right here. What a lot of us thought years ago was that you'd get that adoption curve, right? Where some people would be the early adopters and most of the people didn't. But in fact, the people who were good became better and the rest of the people stayed pretty mediocre. So I think we'll get some super large companies that have clout that will help the digital health space. But I agree with you that most of them will be mired in HR mediocrity.
A couple of modifiers. I think, having gotten very close to PBGH again recently, I think Elizabeth Mitchell's team is trying to think about refereeing some of these point solutions much more systematically.
They're so desperate they contacted me. I'll tell you that.
Yeah, well, probably at my suggestion. But Jeff, you and I had a conversation last week, which was very helpful, about the workforce thing, and that Washington Post piece that you shared. I thought had a very good review of some of the mega trends. I actually used some of that data with a board last week, and one of the guys on the board is an ex-Goldman Sachs guy, and we sort of in real time parsed out what trends are permanent and what trends are temporary. There was a huge amount of stimulus money for low-income people that kept them on the sidelines, right? But we've seen, to Jess's point, a massive drop in women labor force participation rate that is a long-standing permanent effect. Labor markets tend to be pretty efficient, but I do think this is a problem for the long run, and automation is one. The other one is immigration. We've gone from 1.2 million people a year to 250,000.
Right.
That's a huge drop, and the automation piece is critical. Although, if you look at that old OECD report, compared to most other industries, this is a hard thing to automate. You're not going to, your iPhone is not going to change your diapers. I'm sorry, it's just not happening.
I think you hit on the two things which you look at. So come back to you, Bill, on the stuff you're seeing. There's a lot of new businesses, new services. Can we build a new virtual care service to replace what we got? But if you go back to selling to the current incumbents, right? The problem they've got is workforce, and the answer, as you said, is automation. And there are answers for this stuff. There is. That you've got a company like an Olive or an Acasa, which are selling essentially automation of clerks, of office workers. There are, if you go to Japan, there are robots picking people out of bed and changing the diaper and stuff. We're not quite there yet. It's the same kind of story with the self-driving cars. We haven't quite got rid of truckers. We haven't quite got rid of taxi drivers yet. You can see it in the distance, but it's not quite there yet. Is the answer that we're just going to have this massive labor shortage for years to come in healthcare until we figure out automation of stuff that is physical tasks by humans?
Well,
what do you think, Bill?
Automation knows the answer. The problem with healthcare is technologies. Well, first off, just generally, technology is enabler, and it gets to the IBM Watson thing. One of the problems with IBM Watson is it only thought in 2 dimensions, not 3 dimensions. right? If you ask IBM Watson, does the water run up or down? It has no clue, but a human person can tell you it's upstream or downstream, right? And so what happens is it's the same thing with all this other stuff, whether it's automation, is just that it's all good to a point, but there still has to be labor in the human form to do a lot of the things that have to be done within healthcare. And where I think I agree with Jess, it's, not only the female workforce, but minority, diversity, include, all those, it's just, we're running into a massive shortage in healthcare for a lot of different reasons. I think Jean-Luc mentioned it as well.
We created that shortage. By diverting half of clinician time into typing.
Right.
To solve
That's where the
problem
technology
that
comes
Michael
in.
Millinson wrote about in his book 25 years ago.
Right.
We have wasted an astonishing amount of extremely valuable time by double and triple checking and by double and triple documenting what stuff is doing. And I wrote a large check about 6 weeks ago for a company that seems to have fixed it. It's a company called Health Tensor. They use AI and robotic process automation tools to literally go back and read the entire medical record when someone's trying to create a diagnostic note, and it's gotten it down to 5 minutes. It abstracts all the stuff you need, and you basically point and click, and you're done. So they've taken the amount of documentation time necessary to create a diagnostic note down by 3/4. Now, I wrote him a check, my first check in 16 years, because I thought it was a really great idea, and it addressed the issue that they aren't coming back. A lot of those folks just aren't interested in typing. And the 3 founders of this company were all pre-meds that when they talked to their elders about, why do you really want to be a doctor? They were like, I don't want to be a doctor. I don't want to be typing half the time. And they decided to be computer scientists instead and fix the darn problem. So, I think it's stuff like that. I think there's a lot here. I think there are solutions to these problems, but it's going to be culling through the 8,000 companies that have sucked down all this money and finding the 10 or 20 that really make a difference. That's going to be the hard part.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. And if all we do is pave the cow path, and replace a in-person visit with a telehealth visit, that is nothing.
Nope.
We have to redesign clinical processes end to end to be more digital in their mix. And I'll give you a further example I stole from Bob Wachter. There has been a 5-fold increase since 2016 in the number of messages to UCSF faculty through MyChart. And it is overwhelming people, clinicians, because they're spending, all their time answering random questions. And now we're all for patient experience, but the workload of unpaid digital, interaction with patients is just overwhelming people, and they don't get any money for it.
Right.
Because back to Michael's point, we're still in a fee-for-service system, volume-based, baby, and that's till we fix that.
So we need a code for answering emails. I think there is one somewhere. All right, we are close to the end here, so real quick go around to figure out what people are. I guess is the stock market going up and down, and then what the question would be. You answered the question you would like to have been asked in this go round. I'm going to start with you, Michael.
Actually, Jeff just gave me a small bit of reason for optimism. And that's because when he talked about not writing a check for 16 years, because Jeff's real smart about what's been going on. And that means he and the company he mentioned are finally seeing that there may be enough pain for the healthcare system to change. And when I see that the fee for service is what it is, and I see some of the out of touch kinds of things I hear from policy people about transformation, it makes me a bit despairing. But if we finally get enough pain that they can't just let things go on the way they are and need to have transformation from digital health and need to have transformation, that'll be good. But I have been a wrong optimist very consistently for many years, but I hope that eventually the optimism will prove true. So the kind of terrible things we're discussing, I will choose to see that maybe the healthcare system will actually feel pain enough to do something about it.
Right, wrap up music suggested by Jessica here. I'm going to start humming. JL.
Like the Oscars.
So I think what I'm going to be following and see if I can get more information on Biden's newly relaunched cancer moonshot. So the initiative to reduce cancer deaths by half by 2047, I think very interesting. I think there will clearly need to be a technology piece there, totally rethinking about how we provide cancer care. And the use of the word moonshot, I think, is very interesting because, as you know, the founders of Startup Health are close to the Biden administration. So I'm interested to see
They took that from him.
That's right.
He stole it from the Beatles and they're stealing it back or whatever. Jeff. Jeff.
Pardon. As I reflect on what we've been talking about here, I mean, Ian and I have been in this forecasting business for most of our professional lives. The hard part isn't figuring out what's going to happen. It's figuring out how long it's going to take for it to happen. And, I wrote a book called On Digital Medicine, Implications for Healthcare Leaders in 2003. I had a 2013 scenario that I am convinced is going to happen, but it was nowhere nowhere close in 2013. So, to me, I'm really enthused about a lot of these tools companies that Jess has been talking about. I think if we can figure out how to use those tools, we're going to be ahead of this game. But this industry cannot implement stuff to save its life. And I think the implementers are the people that are really going to conquer in this next 5 to 10 years.
Ian.
Well, in fact, you'll remember, Matthew, when we were at the Institute together, we had a file cabinet we called Permanently Emerging Technologies. But I actually share the optimism. I do think there's a lot of promising tools. That's why I listen. I'm waiting for Jess's podcast, then I can really subscribe. But here's the deal. We've got to find a way to embed them very quickly. I think actually the good news is the Omicron death wave is going to peak in the next 2 weeks. And I think until we get a month behind our belt, the traditional health system can come up for a breather. And maybe we can engage that system on implementation, as Jeff said, with these tools. And the timing may be right. That maybe some of the new guys come with a little bit more humility now they've had slapped around the head about their offerings. But I think the key to this is let's get the digital stuff embedded in the traditional health system much more effectively.
Jessica.
Could you imagine if John F. Kennedy just relaunched the initial moonshot? Like, how do you relaunch a moonshot? I mean, that was like the language used to take us to the moon, right? Like, that was, how do you, I'm relaunching this moonshot. Jeff, you should republish your book, In the Spirit of All Things Do-Over. What have I got my eye on? Vive or hymns, people? That's what I'm wondering about. Which I think is a sign of the times in this technology conversation that we're having. No, stick with me for a sec. So HIMSS, the old incumbent health IT conference that everybody had to be at, I'm hearing that not a lot of people are headed to this, and instead the Chime and Health partnership that has now led to Vive, which is focused on hospital administrator, hospital IT, chief digital transformation officer, that's the place to go. So maybe we'll get a little better at integrating this stuff. I mean, I don't
know. We shall see if anybody shows up to either Miami Beach or Orlando. All right, and Bill, take us out.
Thank you. Look, no matter what's happening in the market, digital in the last 10 years has transformed healthcare like no other industry has been transformed. And I agree with Ian. How do we get this stuff implemented and the right tools implemented? And as Jeff said, there's so many good tools and technologies out there, and some that we don't even know about, some kid in a basement's making. So I'm so bullish on digital today and where it's going. But it'll just sort itself out as time goes on, what's the best and what's not. But it's so vital and important to all of healthcare that if we're not investing in it and growing it, then we're not advancing healthcare.
Whoops. All right. And with that, we are out for another week of THCB Gang. I want to thank my guests. A great and vibrant discussion on all of this stuff. Including our guest Bill Taranto from Merck in New Jersey. We had Jail Neptune from New York City, Ian Morrison from Menlo Park, California, Jeff Goldsmith from the wilds of Virginia, Jess DaMassa from the beautiful state of Florida, which abides by all kinds of good healthcare practices, Jacksonville, and Michael Wilson from Chicago. I am Matthew Holt. This is saying goodbye to another week of THCB Gang. Thanks for listening, either live on the video, catching the video later, or on the podcast. And yes, Jess will have her own podcast series coming out very soon, finally on the WTF channel, which we'll find out more about. So with that, we are done for the week. We'll see you again next week.